The Persian Gulf is the jugular vein of the global economy, and right now, someone is holding a knife to it. Roughly 20% of the world's oil passes through the Strait of Hormuz every single day. That's not a statistic you memorize for a trivia night. That's the number that determines whether factories in Ohio run, whether gas prices in Texas double overnight, whether the pension funds holding energy stocks survive the next quarter intact. And today, with tensions between the United States, Israel, and Iran sitting at levels we haven't seen in decades, that strait, just 21 miles wide at its narrowest point, has become the most dangerous stretch of water on the planet. What most Americans aren't being told is that this isn't simply about nukes or ideology. This is about who controls the economic architecture of the 21st century. Oil is not just energy, oil is the dollar, and the dollar is American power. When you understand that, everything happening in the Gulf right now starts making a different kind of sense, a colder, more calculated kind. So let me think about what is actually happening here, and let me walk you through it slowly, because this deserves the kind of careful attention that mainstream media simply refuses to give it. Go back to the 1970s for a moment. After Nixon closed the gold window in 1971, the United States had a serious problem. The dollar was no longer backed by anything tangible. The world knew it, foreign governments knew it, and American policymakers knew it. So what did they do? They made a deal with Saudi Arabia specifically. The arrangement was straightforward. Saudi Arabia and OPEC would price oil exclusively in US dollars, and in return, America would guarantee Saudi security with its military umbrella. That agreement essentially re-anchored the dollar, not to gold, but to oil. And from that moment forward, every nation on earth that needed to buy oil had to first acquire US dollars, every single one, which means they had to participate in the American financial system whether they wanted to or not. That is what the petrodollar system is, and that system has been the bedrock of American global dominance for over 50 years. Now here is where it gets uncomfortable. Iran does not participate in that system. Iran sells oil in euros, in yuan, in rubles, in whatever currency it can arrange bilaterally with its trade partners. And Iran has been doing this increasingly, especially after the 2012 sanctions effectively cut Tehran off from the SWIFT banking system. What Washington intended as punishment, Tehran treated as motivation. They built alternative trade corridors. They deepened ties with China and Russia. They helped lay the groundwork for what is now being called the dedollarization movement, a slow but very real shift in how large portions of the global economy conduct trade without touching the American financial system. And that, more than any nuclear file, more than any proxy militia, more than any rhetoric about wiping anyone off the map, is what keeps certain people in Washington awake at night. Because if the petrodollar system unravels, even partially, the consequences for ordinary Americans would be severe in ways that almost nobody in mainstream media is willing to discuss honestly. Think about what the petrodollar actually does for America. It creates a permanent artificial demand for US dollars globally. That artificial demand allows the Federal Reserve to print money far beyond what a normal economy could sustain without triggering hyperinflation. It allows the US government to run perpetual deficits that would bankrupt any other nation on earth. It keeps interest rates lower than they would otherwise be, which keeps mortgage payments lower, keeps consumer credit flowing, keeps the whole debt-fueled consumer economy humming along. The moment that artificial demand for dollars begins to shrink meaningfully, all of those hidden subsidies that Americans have been quietly enjoying for decades start to disappear. Prices go up, the cost of borrowing goes up, the standard of living goes down, not because of bad luck, because of a structural shift that was entirely predictable and entirely ignored by the people who were supposed to be managing it. Now place Iran into that picture, and it becomes very clear why Iran is not simply a regional problem. Iran is a linchpin in the emerging alternative architecture. It sits at the crossroads between Russia, Central Asia, the Gulf states, and South Asia. It controls the northern shore of the Strait of Hormuz. It has deep relationships with China. A 25-year strategic cooperation agreement signed in 2021 that involves hundreds of billions of dollars in Chinese investment in exchange for discounted Iranian oil. It has military and intelligence relationships with Russia that have only deepened since 2022, and it has successfully shown other countries, Venezuela, Cuba, North Korea, and increasingly middle-ground nations like India and Turkey, that it is possible to operate outside the American financial system and survive. That demonstration effect is arguably the most dangerous thing Iran does from Washington's perspective, not the centrifuges. The example: So when you hear discussions in Washington about military options against Iran, you need to understand that the nuclear file is the public justification. It is not the actual driver. The actual driver is the need to prevent Iran from continuing to serve as a proof of concept for the rest of the world. A successful sovereign Iran that trades freely outside the dollar system, that maintains its independence from American financial coercion, and that thrives economically despite sanctions is a message to every other country watching. You can do this too. And that message, spreading quietly through the global south, through BRICS summits and bilateral agreements and currency swap arrangements, is genuinely destabilizing to the architecture of American power, not militarily, financially. But let's talk about the military dimension now, because it's real and it's terrifying and it needs to be said plainly. If the United States or Israel, with American backing, launches a significant military strike against Iran, the Iranian response is not going to be a few symbolic missile launches and then quiet diplomacy. That is not the doctrine Iran has built. Iran has spent decades preparing for exactly this scenario, and the core of its deterrence strategy is the ability to make any military confrontation economically catastrophic for the entire world, not just for itself. The Strait of Hormuz is the instrument of that deterrence. Iran does not need to defeat the US Navy in a conventional battle. It does not need to shoot down F-35s. It needs to make the strait impassable or sufficiently dangerous to transit for long enough that the global oil market goes into a panic that no government can politically survive. Think about what that actually means in practical terms. The strait is 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. Iran has land-based anti-ship missiles positioned along its coastline. It has swarms of small, fast attack boats that have been specifically designed and drilled to overwhelm larger naval vessels through sheer numbers and coordination. It has underwater mines that it can deploy rapidly. It has submarines. And it has proxies in Yemen, in Iraq, in Lebanon, who can simultaneously attack Gulf state infrastructure, tanker traffic, and Israeli targets in a coordinated multi-front pressure campaign that stretches response capacity thin. The Houthis alone demonstrated in 2023 and 2024 that a relatively lightly armed non-state actor can effectively disrupt a major international shipping corridor for months. Imagine that multiplied across multiple theaters with Iran's own military assets directly engaged. The insurance markets understand this even if the cable news panels don't. War risk premiums on tanker insurance in the Gulf spike the moment tensions rise. Shipping companies begin rerouting around the Cape of Good Hope, adding weeks and thousands of dollars per voyage at the first serious sign of conflict. And none of that rerouting actually solves the problem because the world does not have enough alternative tanker capacity to fully replace Hormuz traffic on alternative routes within any short-term window. You are talking about 17 to 20 million barrels of oil per day flowing through that strait. Japan gets roughly 80% of its oil through Hormuz. South Korea, similar numbers. China is heavily dependent. India is heavily dependent. Even the United States, which has reduced its own direct imports from the Gulf over the years, is deeply exposed through its allies, through the global price mechanism, and through the financial markets that are priced on global oil benchmarks. And here's the thing about oil prices that people forget in peacetime. Oil is not just transportation fuel. Oil is embedded in the cost of everything. It is in the fertilizer that grows the food. It is in the plastic that packages the food. It is in the freight cost that ships the food. It is in the asphalt that builds the road the truck drives on. When oil prices double, and they can double very fast in a Hormuz closure scenario, inflation doesn't just creep up a percentage point or two. It rips through supply chains in ways that take years to fully work through. We got a mild preview of that dynamic in 2021 and 2022 after the supply disruptions related to COVID and then the Ukraine war. That was mild. A full Hormuz closure would be several orders of magnitude more severe. And yet there is something almost surreal about the way this risk is discussed in American public life. It is acknowledged in think tank papers. It is modeled in war games at the Pentagon. The insurance markets price it. The oil futures markets price it. But in the mainstream political conversation, particularly in election cycles, it is treated as an abstraction, a foreign policy talking point, not as the concrete material threat to American living standards that it actually represents. Part of that is because the financial system has become very good at absorbing shocks in the short term through mechanisms like the Strategic Petroleum Reserve releases, emergency OPEC coordination, and Federal Reserve liquidity injections. But those mechanisms are not infinite. The SPR has been drawn down significantly. OPEC's spare capacity is not what it once was, and the Federal Reserve, after years of balance sheet expansion, has far less room to maneuver than it did before 2008. What makes this moment particularly sharp is the convergence of pressures. You have the de-dollarization trend accelerating. You have BRICS expanding its membership to include major oil producers like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Iran itself. You have China and Russia deepening their economic integration with the Gulf in ways that were unthinkable a decade ago. You have the United States locked into political commitments to Israel that constrain its diplomatic flexibility in the region. And you have an Iranian government that, whatever you think of it ideologically, has proven itself remarkably resilient under pressure and has every strategic incentive to continue doing what it is doing rather than capitulate to American demands. The honest question, the one that serious analysts are wrestling with, is whether the United States and its allies have actually thought through what happens the morning after a military strike on Iran. Not the first 48 hours, which might feel decisive and clean, the months after, the years after, because history suggests that military force has not resolved the underlying tensions in the Middle East. It has crystallized them. It has hardened positions, created new grievances, expanded the recruiting base for every armed group in the region, and generated unintended consequences that planners somehow always seem to fail to anticipate. Iraq did not become a stable pro-American democracy after 2003. Libya did not become a stable pro-Western state after 2011. Syria did not neatly resolve. And Iran is a significantly more coherent, more capable, more strategically sophisticated state than any of those countries were. The people whose savings are in dollar-denominated assets, whose mortgages are priced in dollars, whose retirement accounts depend on the stability of American financial markets, those people have a direct material stake in how this plays out, and most of them are not being given the information they need to understand what is actually at risk. They are being given narratives about threats and deterrence and red lines. They are not being told that the global financial architecture their prosperity depends on is in the middle of the most significant structural challenge it has faced since Bretton Woods. They are not being told that a war in the Gulf could accelerate that challenge in ways that no amount of military success on the battlefield could reverse. Because once the world sees that the Strait of Hormuz can be closed, once the insurance maps get redrawn, once the alternative trade corridors that bypass the dollar system prove their resilience under pressure, the confidence that underpins the entire petrodollar structure shifts, and confidence in financial systems is everything. It is the only thing. Once it begins to move, it moves faster than any government can manage. That is the real edge the world economy is sitting on right now. Not just the price of oil, not just the flow of tankers through a narrow strait, but the question of whether the system that has organized global trade and finance for the past 50 years can survive the combination of internal contradictions and external pressures that are now converging on it simultaneously, and the answer to that question will be decided in no small part by what happens next in the Persian Gulf.